So good morning. Those of you who don't know me, I am Professor Ian Gadd. I am Chair of the Board here at the Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution. And before I formally welcome you and kick off today's, or this weekend's proceedings, just to say that you'll be pleased to know, we do not have any fire drills planned for the weekend, which does mean that should the alarm sound, you will need to exit accordingly, either down the stairs you came, or if you're in the towards the back, there is a fire exit there. Head out, down the stairs, out to Queen Square, turn right, and we will attempt to congregate all 80 of you just on the corner of Chapel Row. But hopefully that will not be necessary. So, on behalf of the Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution, and in partnership with the Bath branch of the Historical Association and the History of the Bath Research Group, we would like to welcome you to this wonderful weekend of talks and opportunities to discuss and learn about history in Bath. This is our bicentenary year, as many of you will know, 2024 into early 2025. And the bicentenary has been an opportunity for us to look back, as one does when one reaches a milestone birthday, to look back at ourselves and our own history as an institution from, as many of you will know, a building that was purpose-built for us, overlooking what is now Parade Gardens, to where we are now, where we've been for just over 90 years, here in a Grade 1 listed building. It has also been an opportunity during this year to put on many talks and other activities that reflect on the history of Bath. And that is something that in some ways has culminated in this weekend's events. I'm hoping that every one of you who sat down saw the little leaflet that was on your seat before you sat down, which gives you a flavour, a taste of the range of talks that BRLSI puts on and is putting on. Some of those talks are linked to our bicentenary, but I'm very pleased to say, it's one of the reasons I am so proud of the institution, these kind of talks we're putting on week in, week out, every year. They are organised by volunteers, and we have a number of volunteers here in the room. So if any of you have not encountered the institution before, or have sat in the audience and thought, actually, it would be great if we had a talk on this particular topic, please do get in contact with us, because we are always looking for further volunteers. Just as a highlight, just to return back to our bicentenary, or frame this within our bicentenary, we have in January, it's strange, our birthday is 13 months long, and our final finale set of events takes place in January, which is the 200th anniversary of when the institution first opened its doors. And it opened with a scientific lecture in January 1825, and we will be having a special lecture delivered by Professor Frank James from UCL in January that will reflect on that lecture and what that lecture tells us about the history of science in Bath. And then a few days later, on the 21st of January, so exactly 200 years to the day, we have a series of special events, including the unveiling of specially commissioned artwork about BRLSI and the history of BRLSI in Parade Gardens, which will be unveiled by the Mayor of Bath and and I'm embarrassing him here because he's sitting in the audience, our honorary president for the bicentenary, Lord Kerry, who has agreed to act as our honorary president throughout our bicentenary year. It's not just talks, we also publish, perhaps not as actively publishing as we could be, but we have published a number of historical books through the institution, and very encourage you to take a look at those. You can see those downstairs. And then, of course, as you will hear a bit later in the weekend, we have extensive collections in this building, 10,000 historical volumes, printed books and manuscripts, 150,000 objects. And depending on how narrow or broad your historical lens is, we have something, I think, for everyone. So we have, you'll hear, and I don't want to anticipate, some of the treasures that our curator, Matt Williams, will be talking about later this weekend. But all of you walked past probably the oldest thing in the whole of Bath as you walked through the Jennings room downstairs, a 4.2 billion year old meteorite that we have on display here. So one has a real sense of history when one walks into this building. So I'm going to conclude my opening remarks by thanking you again for coming, and I hope you have a fantastic 2 days of historical discussion. And I'm going to hand over to my colleague, fellow director David Hall, who, with his wife Barbara, have been the leads for so many of our bicentenary events, including this weekend, and the success of this weekend in terms of its vision and the talks you're going to hear is in very large part down to the very hard work that they have put in. So I'll hand over to David, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Ian. History is such a pervasive feature of Bath that we thought it would be a great idea to celebrate it. We not only have the environment, we have the universities, we have teachers of history, and so many people who are enthusiastically researching the past of the area and publishing and giving us lots of information. And there is the general public. Let's not forget the ones who like to dress up in Regency costume and parade around town. They too have an interest in history. So it's safe to say that history is very big in Bath. We thought it'd be valuable if we could bring together a lot of us under the same roof and have an opportunity for the different groups to explain what they do. We have displays in the 2 rooms next door, as well as the Bath Record Office, who brought along some wonderful things for you to look at. We have a lot of wonderful contributors to the weekend, including what I think is one of the most distinguished archaeologists in the country, who we're very pleased to welcome this morning. For the weekend, we have a similar pattern today and tomorrow. We have some talks of around an hour, we have some talks of around 30 minutes, and we have some quick fire sessions which are going to be looking at ways in which we can delve a bit deeper, looking at different resources for historical research in the area. We have a pretty full program, so there won't always be time for questions at the end of each session. We hope there'll be some at the end of Sir Barry's talk, but then later on it may be a case of seeing if you can talk to the speaker in a break. We have 30-minute breaks, so there'll be time to network, there'll be time to look at the displays and get to know one another. And then after the talks, middle of tomorrow afternoon, we're going to finish off the festival tomorrow with a forum session where we hope that people with a love of history in the city can get together and talk about how we can do more for history in one way or another. There are lots of different groups, there are lots of different interests. How can we collaborate? And is there any way in which perhaps we can share our love of history with a wider public by seeing if we can get behind some sort of special event? who knows that tomorrow afternoon everybody's welcome to come and put their ideas forward and see if we might even come up with a plan. Who knows? If you have some ideas, we have a board, a flip chart board and some post-it notes, and if you've got an idea, stick it on a post-it note and stick it on the board. Anyway, I'll now hand over, if I can, to Stephen Bird, who's going to chair the morning sessions. Stephen is equally distinguished. He rose to become the Council's head of Heritage Services, and he masterminded the transformation of the Roman baths into pretty much the state that they are in now, although I know he would say that others have carried on his work after him. Who better to introduce the man whose muddy trowel actually did so much to expand our knowledge of what was underneath the pump room and those buildings around there, and eventually persuade the powers that be that they really ought to open that up to the general public as well as the bits with the water in. So I'll pass over to Stephen, and then just after I finish, I'm hoping that our technician, Ollie, will come along and change the slide presentation to Sir Barry's, because we're going to be recording his talk, and we hope to have it on YouTube in due course if anybody wants to listen again. Stephen.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, David. It is a great privilege and a pleasure to be able to introduce Professor Sir Barry Cunliffe to you this morning. Barry has been an integral part and the inspiration really behind the archaeology of Bath he'll won't like me saying this, probably for at least 50 years now. Barry, I'm not going to speak for long because you're not here to hear me, you're here to hear Barry, but after taking a degree in archaeology and anthropology at St John's College, Cambridge, Barry became a lecturer at Bristol University in archaeology, and then became one of the youngest professors ever of archaeology at Southampton University, all within striking distance of Bath, you note. And then from 1971, he was Professor of European Archaeology at Oxford University. In the 1970s, Barry demonstrated one of his great skills, and that is persuading people to do what was thought to be impossible. And working with the then Chief Executive of Bath City Council, David Beaton, and the Chairman of the Spa and Recreation Committee, Laurie Coombs, he presented this entirely reasonable concept that one should prop up the pump room on steel beams and excavate it underneath it. And it's so powerful was his persuasion that they agreed to it. I was fortunate to come to Bath in 1980 with the quaint title of Senior Keeper and Keeper of Local History, based at the Roman Baths. And that is when I first met Barry. In fact, Barry won't remember this, but the very first time Barry and I met was when he was concluding his second season of excavations in the Sacred Spring under the King's Bath. And I went down into the bowels of the earth just to see what was going on. And this figure emerged, and he emerged from the mud. And he won't remember that, but I think he's chosen an entirely appropriate title for his lecture this morning. So I give you Professor Sir Barry Cunliffe. Barry.
That's not my image. Thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's an enormous pleasure always to come to Bath and to meet people who are working on Bath's history. It is an incredible history, and when I was putting this talk together, I thought the best thing to do is to introduce the main archaeological monuments of the centre of Bath through the history of their discovery. So we've got two themes here, the monuments themselves and the people who helped discover them. And I suppose if there is a theme, apart from Bath, if there is a theme, it is that archaeology is a continuous process. And we are in the middle of discovering about Bath. And what we've discovered in the past will be a basis for people to build on for the future. So it's an absolute continuum. And it's quite interesting, the history of Bath archaeology, in that it seems to go in cycles. There's a period of activity and major discovery, and then a dull period for a while, and then another period of major discovery, and so on. So the history of the archaeology is, I think, as interesting as the archaeology itself. Now, excuse me, we start, I think, with Speed's map of Bath, 1611, I think it is, which gives a very good idea of the Roman, what it would have looked like in the Roman period. The wall is there, that almost intact. It's medieval, and then before that it is Roman. And then in the middle, of course, one has a group of public buildings, including the great the Bath, the point where water at the rate of, what is it, nearly a million litres a day pours out of the ground. It's a real force, and that's always been there as far as humans are concerned. Even in the Mesolithic period, we know that the hunter-gatherers came and settled briefly around these springs. Presumably they attracted wildlife. They were good places to be, particularly in the winter. So there's been a continuous history focused around that great gush of water, or rather the three gushes of water, but mainly the King's Bath Spring. And we see it here in a late 17th century image with visitors sort of yelling abuse, presumably, at the people who are swimming around there and pelting them with rubbish and so on. That's one of the joys of Bath. Then below all that, there is the Roman, or there's the medieval, the Saxon, and then the Roman city, settlement. We know about the Roman wall. Very curious, it only, I think it's about 25 acres, only about a quarter the size of the average Roman town. So almost certainly this wall is not a town wall as such, but is the wall of a temenos, the sacred buildings which were protected. And beyond that, particularly along the road going north, the London road going north, the rest of the city developed. And then here is our focal point, the spring. There's another spring there and another spring there. Hot Bath, the King's Bath Spring, the Cross Bath Spring, and the Hot Bath Spring. And they were all used excuse me, in the Roman period. What I'm going to really talk about today are the discovery of these buildings, the great temple to Sulis Minerva and the bathing establishment. There are a lot of other buildings around, bits of building you can see found from the 18th century onwards. Really, I suppose the discovery of Bath, Roman Bath, starts with John Leyland in reign of Henry VIII. He travelled around the countryside and recorded antiquities. And when he came to Bath, he recorded various stones, inscriptions, stones from the cemetery and so on. And from then on, little bits were recorded, reminding people at the time that Bath was a Roman site by origin. Excuse me. One of those winter colds, I'm afraid. He did indeed publish these remains, and then Camden, Guido, and people like that recognized bits of Roman material. They knew that Bath was a Roman site because a Roman writer, Solinus, in the 3rd century AD, had written about the hot springs in Britain, presided over by the goddess Minerva, and he tells us that on Minerva's altar, the fire never goes to ash, but turns into rocky lumps. It's an interesting little observation. And archaeologists have, for a long time, thought that what he's talking about is the burning of Somerset coal. You're not burning wood, which goes to ash, you're burning coal, which turns to cinder. And indeed, in the 19th century, some coal ash was found in the temple precinct, which tends to support this. Now, whoops, sorry. Where am I going? I'm going the wrong way. How do I go backwards on this? There we are, I've got it. Sorry. I show two maps here. One is Bath in about 1720, and the other is Bath under John Wood, to remind us that the city started to grow in the 1720s, with little bits of development north and south there, and then Wood's great development all the way around, turning it into the city that we know and love today. And it was really during this development in 1727 that this was the time, of course, when people coming to Bath more and more and more, and it was becoming very fashionable. In 1727, they were doing what all fashionable people wanted done. They were putting in decent sewers so that the garbage shouldn't have to be thrown into the streets and carted off. And one of the sewers they put in was in Stall Street down here, and found the most remarkable object. And if you can sort of think back to that time when there wasn't much information about Bath, Roman Bath. We knew that there was a temple of Minerva, and then suddenly what should be found, the first major thing, the head of the cult statue of Minerva. And it was dug up by workmen somewhere by the pump room now, under Stall Street. This incredible bronze head, gilded, and her head is cut, the top of the head is cut off because she wore a great Corinthian helmet, a huge Corinthian helmet. And this, a life-size statue, would have stood in the cellar in the main sacred room of the temple. So what an incredible discovery to sort of open up Bath's archaeology. Bath's archaeology has always been dramatic. The little, the bath which we saw, the King's Bath, behind this building here, was where the sacred spring was, the Roman sacred spring. The statue, the head of Minerva, was found somewhere along the street just beyond these buildings. And then as Bath became more and more geared to its elite audience coming down to take the waters, so of course the buildings improved and improved. And here we have this lovely little orangery built by John Harvey in 1706. In fact, it was only 4 bays, and another bay was added in the 1770s. And this was the first pump room, and you can actually see, you can either go into the pump room and then look through the far window into the spring, or you could go down that tunnel and go down into the water yourself. And of course, it was too small. Soon, people wanted a bigger one. And at the end of the 18th century, in 1790, John Palmer was asked to build a new pump room, the one we have today. And he dug a massive foundation. It's a big building compared with a light little building there. He dug a massive foundation here for the main facade. And that we know from contemporary records, he went down something like 4 meters until he found a solid base upon which to build. And in those 4 meters, he found huge quantities of Roman stonework. The most important thing he found, of course, was the great pediment, this amazing piece of Romano-British art, this great river god, displayed as the Gorgon, the fearsome head that could turn you into stone. And it's held on a great shield, and it's held aloft by two winged victories. We've got bits of both of them there. Wonderful image, frightening image. And we know there are little references to Minerva here. There is Minerva's Corinthian helmet there. And just there, you probably can't see it here but very well, but just there is a little owl, which is, again, one of the symbols that you find with Minerva. So these blocks of stone that were found, it was quite clear that they had discovered in 1790 the main facade of the temple of Minerva. So 1727, you find the head of Minerva. 1790, you find the whole facade, or nearly the whole facade of the temple. Amazing, absolutely amazing. And they've found also bits of the entablature, the cornices and the columns and so on. And a great deal was written about this at the time. Governor Parnell wrote about it in 1796. And then in 1813, Samuel Lysons produced his great description with this wonderful illustration, reconstruction of the temple front as he thought it would be, and as probably it was. He had all the bits there to be able to reconstruct the whole of the temple front. And I guess some of you will have noticed how similar it is to the front of the pump room. Not a coincidence, I'm sure. I don't know that there are records of this. There may well be. But Palmer, John Palmer, who was building this, the excavation took place for the foundations in 1790. It wasn't until 1796 that the building was completed. And in that time, Palmer would have known all this about the temple. And I can't help feeling that he used that as an image for the front of the pump room. So when you look at that now, this presumably was the architect changing his plans in the light of archaeological discoveries. Now, nothing much happened after the 1790 discoveries. They were published, as I say, particularly by Lysons, and a very good publication it is. And then a few more odds and ends were found. Some Roman baths had been found in the 1750s. But it was time to bring all the bits together. And the person who did it was the Reverend Scarfe. He was the rector of Bathwick, 1825 to 1900. And he wrote Aequae Solis, this lovely book on Bath, in 1864. 1864 is a key date in the history of the discovery of Roman Bath. What he did was to bring together everything that was known about Roman Bath into one single volume. And it was a very interesting year, because it, it was a year when Gilbert Scott came to Bath to, I was going to say reconstruct the abbey, but to do a lot of work on the abbey, to turn it into the abbey we know today. A conservation architect, famous conservation architect. And he brought with him a man called James Thomas Irvine. And I can't, unfortunately, find a picture of Irvine. But Irvine was his clerk of works. He came from an island to the north of one of the northernmost islands of the Shetland group, so right from the fringes of Britain, and he worked on a number of major abbeys and cathedrals, and Bath was one of them. And he was very highly thought of by Gilbert Scott. Irvine was present along with Gilbert Scott, 1864, so he came when this book was published. Oh dear. He knew Scarfe, and there is some correspondence between them, actually, in the Society's collections, interesting correspondence. Irving was, I think, a brilliant archaeologist. Goodness knows where he was trained. He presumably trained himself. He had an inquiring mind and a desire and a real sort of sense of accuracy and recording. And what he did was, whilst he was working with Gilbert Scott, he was running around and trying to sort out the Roman temple in Bath. And he thought, he knew, of course, where the temple facade was found, underneath the pump room. He knew about the head of Minerva. And he took an interest in the White Hart Hotel, which was opposite the pump room on the other side of Stall Street. And the White Hart Hotel in 1864 was about to be demolished and rebuilt into the Grand Pump Room Hotel, which you can see up there, great monster, facing the pump room, the Stall Street side of the pump room. And Irving, at his own volition, there was no one here to talk to him about it or anything. Scarfe was very much an antiquary, a collector of information. Irving was a practical man. So what he did, he reckoned that there would be something over there. And when the site became available, he did what any good archaeologist would do. He rushed in, got into the cellars and dug holes in the cellars to find out what was underneath. And when they started, that was 1864, when they started building in 1867 to 9, he was there recording remains all the time. He was the first real rescue archaeologist that we have. And I show you one of his recordings. All the records when I was working on them, they were actually in this room, I think. This was where the library was. And I remember going through them and being absolutely astounded by the quality of them. It doesn't come out terribly well in the photograph, but here is one of his notes. Many of them have got dirty finger marks on. You know, he's down in the trenches, he's covered in mud, and he's recording. And he's recording, it says there, I think, platform of temple. He finds this great mass of concrete underneath, just underneath there. And he recognizes it for the podium of the temple, which he was looking for. And he records details of it, other walls around, everything recorded to an accuracy of 1/4 of an inch. Now, this is my redrawing of some of Irving's drawings, so there you see it there. There's the pump room. So, and Irving was convinced that this was the temple itself, the temple platform. Some steps had been found here under the pump room in 1790. So he said these were the front steps of the temple. And he also drew archaeological sections. These are, again, my redrawings of his sections for clarity. But here, for example, this section here, cut through the concrete of the foundation. He shows it in detail, the large stone slabs, and what we would archaeologically call a robber trench, a trench which has been dug to take the stone slabs from the side of the temple podium. He finds medieval pits cut down into it, and then archaeological stratigraphy. It is an amazing piece of recording. And so we owe to him the discovery, really, of where the temple was. Now, Irving, as I say, was here until from 1864 to 1871. And he corresponded during that time with Scarfe, and with a local builder he knew, John Mann, and with this gentleman, Major Charles Davis, who was the city, he was surveyor of works. He was an architect and employed by the city as a surveyor of works. So Davis was as it were, the city architect. and responsible for civic buildings and so on. So all of these people were together and sort of talking and sharing information, and there are letters between them. But Irvine has now gone. This is, I put together here, more or less what was known about the centre of Bath in about 1870. So here, the platform that Irvine found is up here. There is the King's Bath Spring. These bits of baths have been excavated in the 18th century. And then there are all sorts of little bits. Davis was doing some work down here and was finding bits of baths. He was digging a trench along here and was finding bits of the exegery of the Great Bath is there, as you all know. So by 1870, we've got a knowledge that the baths were here on this side of the spring, and Irvine's contention that the temple was up here. Then in 1878, Davis was tasked with stopping a leak in the King's Bath. The water was draining away somewhere and he didn't know how. And he employed this builder, John Mann, to do this. And Irvine wrote to Mann and said, there's a drain, I found a drain, and this would be the drain that he found. This is the drain you can see now, the big Roman drain running out from the museum. He said, I found a drain. So John Mann starts with the drain and works along the drain, clearing it underneath these buildings towards the King's Bath Spring. Incredible piece of work. He's very scathing of Davis. He said at one stage, Davis came to the top of my excavations. He said he had a chill, so he wouldn't come down and look. And there is this John Mann sort of doing this tunnelling work. He describes in one place where they're tunnelling and they keep on finding big stones, fallen Roman stones, and he saws them up underground and uses them as props to prop up the roof of with all those buildings above him. Absolutely incredible. What he did was to, he was coming along the drain, so if you can imagine, here is the drain, and then he suddenly came to this, all underground, suddenly came to this big wall, which we know is one of the walls around the reservoir. And this is what he would have found. This is what you can see now. This is where the water comes out from the spring into the drain. That was actually, it's not an arch as such, it's a relieving arch, and just to take the weight off here, and this would have been filled with stone. So he found this wall, this massive wall, beyond which was the King's Bath Spring. So then he tunnels along here, along the wall, up to there, all underground, and then tunnels all the way along here, along the front of the wall, and this is where he's cutting up stone and propping up the building above him, and then down here. So he's circumnavigated the spring. Then Davis decides that the only thing to do is to take up the pump room, the bath floor, the King's Bath floor, and then to dig down into the spring. And here is the excavation going on in 1878. And I like to think that might be John Mann, but I don't know. But what they've done, you see here is the old King's Bath. They've ripped off the floor, and then they've started going down. And what they do is excavate a lot of the spring itself there, and then prop it up and do various things and put the floor back on in concrete. There's a nice point that Davis makes. Davis describes it briefly and says, we found that this reservoir itself was lined completely in sheets of lead, great sheets of lead. He said, we took them out and used them to furnish sinews for the excavation. In other words, he sold the Roman lead to make money for the work to go on. Not the sort of thing an archaeologist would do nowadays. Well, at least I hope not. it was an amazing discovery in its own time. This led Davis on to follow up other bits and pieces that had been found. I showed you that plan earlier. And he opened up the Great Bath, and I particularly like this photograph because here is the Great Bath, and that's where the water comes in, you know, in one of the corners. And it shows this rather nice 18th century terrace coming right across the Great Bath. And Davis had no compunction at all but to buy it and knock it down. Now you can't even paint the door the colour you want. 18th century buildings removed to expose the baths. And thank goodness, you know, he did that, because the Bath is the most amazing monument. It wouldn't have looked nearly as good with an 18th century building stuck in the middle of it. And then he removed that building, and these are some of the old photographs that show the excavation having taken place, and various stones, carved stones, dotted around. He went on to excavate then the what we would now call the West Baths. That's underneath, that's this way, because there was the idea of creating a douche and massage baths to add to the facilities of the bathing establishment. And he went around tours in Switzerland and Germany and so on, and collected together information about douche and massage baths, came back full of ideas, knocked down the buildings that were there, including the Queen's Bath, and started to build his douche and massage baths. And all hell was then let loose, because Davis was an interesting, fiery character, and made a lot of enemies in the city. There's that wonderful story that is in a newspaper. He has an Irish wolfhound which he sets on the local police at one stage. So he's a man, you know, one can warm to, I think. You know, a fiery character who liked to keep the name Major all the time. You can just imagine. He did make enemies. And this douche and massage baths which he was building, suddenly the locals, including John Mann, complained, and there was a lot of fuss in the newspapers about it. In the end, the Society of Antiquaries of London, which is the foremost archaeological society of the day, sent a deputation down to look at what Davis was doing, and it was a fairly mealy-mouthed report. And Davis just got on with it and built the douche and massage baths, and with the locals saying he's destroying all the Roman work and so on. Just read the local papers. In 1972, the douche and massage baths were demolished, and I had the job of overseeing the unpicking of Davis's foundations. And what I must say is he did a brilliant job of doing as little damage to the Roman work as possible. And you can see those baths now, they're virtually undamaged. And it was very easy just to pick off what Davis had built and see the remains largely unscathed underneath. So I think he got a fair amount of flack unfairly over this. And then after this, there was the great meeting of the British Association. I love this photograph, because they're all dutifully standing there in the pouring rain, getting sopping wet, while Davis is up on this platform here, talking to them about the baths. And there are ladies sheltering in there, and people with their umbrellas up. Miserable day, but look how good they all are, listening to him go on and on and on and on about the baths in the rain. So this was really I think this photograph, 1888, is the sort of culmination of exposing, Davis's exposing of the baths. And this was his plan. So there are still bits unexcavated, you see here. This was the douche and massage baths, which the Roman remains he'd excavated under the douche and massage baths. And this was the bit that was excavated in the 1750s. So he had got most of what we now know. And this is John Mann's drawing of slightly later. This is about 1900. And you see what an amazing man the local builder was. He was really able to... Oh, that plan I showed of the reservoir, that was John Mann's plan. What he did, he was appalled by the lack of record that Davis kept. And he produced a very fine record of all the work that he had done for the city. And this is one of the drawings from it. And he sold that record to the Society of Antiquaries. And it's now in the library of the Society of Antiquaries, the very best record you could find of the excavations, which otherwise we would have had very little detail of, except the remains themselves. So here we are at the end of the 19th century. There is Davis, and there is one of his works that still dominates Bath. It's the Marmite, I think, of Bath's architecture, isn't it? Either you love it or you hate it. I've gone from one to the other. I think now I see it. You know, Davis had such a miserable time. There were all sorts of other incidents which I haven't got time to talk about. And he was being slagged off in the local papers all the time. And this was the Empire Hotel, of course, built in 1900. Davis died in 1902. And I like to think that this is his gesture to Bath. You know, here am I, and I'm going to put this up. And what he's done is to create a beautiful piece. He really integrates the river with the city in a way that Bath has really not done very well with its river frontage on the whole. And I think this shows something of Davis's qualities. But I like to think of him, you know, just up there with his fist against to the city and the abbey and all the rest of it. But he has made a major contribution. Okay. Now, now we go into a quiet period again. What I should have said was that all the stones which had been found in the excavations were in a museum until 1825. And when this society was founded in 1825, they were passed over to the society and looked after by the society until 1900, when they were taken back by the city into the city museum. Now, in 1906, the Victoria County History of Somerset, Volume 1, was published. And in it, Francis Haverfield, a great archaeologist, collected together all the information about Roman Bath that he could find. And here is Francis Haverfield's drawing of what Irvine found. So he shows the platform that Irvine found. Here's the pump room and the spring, and the colonnade around it that Irvine found, and the steps that were found in the 1790s. And he says that, he explains it, and he says that Irvine thinks it's a temple, the temple of Sulis Minerva. All these views are entirely conjectural. It would be idle now to criticize them. In other words, he didn't believe a word of it. And that actually put a stamp on how Bath, the understanding of Bath's archaeology developed in the 20th century. Haverfield was the great man, and he didn't believe Irvine. Why? I don't know. He may even have known Irvine. So he wrote this off. Now, then Sir Ian Richmond was involved in helping the museum display parts of the baths. Sir Ian Richmond was a great archaeologist, a Roman archaeologist from Oxford, and lovely man. And he came to Bath and planned all the masonry of the baths properly for the first time. This was in the 1950s. And he considered the Temple of Sulis Minerva. He accepted what Haverfield had said, that it's not that. Richmond thought that possibly the temple was somewhere over here, looking over the spring, somewhere up here, as it were, looking over the spring. And that was 1955. Then in 1963, he was ailing slightly, and that's when he invited me to take over from him in Bath. And he passed over his wonderful drawings of the baths. And we set up a Bath excavation committee just to oversee work. There was a certain amount of rebuilding in Bath. It was a very dead period for Bath. This was a period when quite a lot of the 18th century workers' housing was being demolished. And it was when Betjeman wrote that dreadful dirge about Bath, farewell to old Bath, we loved you, are sorry, they've carted you off in developer's lorry. There was no sort of little feeling for the history and the archaeology of the city at that time. But there was building work going on. So the Bath Excavation Committee in 1963 we did three things. We did the rescue excavations that had to be done, dotted around in the town when there was building work. We updated all of Richmond's plans of the baths and did some little bits of excavation on the baths. And then we sat down to sort out the temple. And this was the plan we produced, putting Irving's details on and Mann's details. And then we did some excavations and found that this colonnade, which Irving had found, was continuous here. It was difficult, when you put all this together, not to believe that Irving was right, that this was the temple, here was the temple. So what we did was to persuade the city to allow us to go underneath the pump room, here's the pump room, and to dig a trench. Well, no, a couple of trenches. One there to check the temple steps, and one in front of where Irving believed the temple to be. This photograph gives me absolute jitters. Health and Safety at Work Act. There is a trench with amateur shuttering in it. Virtually no space on either side, tools projecting over the edge of the trench, dodgy old ladders, a sewer pipe there which is dripping all the time into the trench, and electricity cables sort of. This was certainly before I was aware of the Health and Safety at Work Act. We did learn a bit more about it later. This is the trench we dug underneath the pump room. The pump room cellar floor was about 2 meters down from the Abbey Yard, and then we dug another 2 meters to find the Roman pavement at the bottom. And during that excavation, seared on my memory, I was there alone one day, just before Christmas, and there again, I shouldn't have been. You never have one person in a trench like this, health and safety again. And discovered this stone, and I remember spending a whole day just clearing the mud away from the stone. And it was just a few days before Christmas, and just up on Stall Street, it was a Salvation Army band playing Herald Angels. It was an amazing moment, that going on all the time, that I was excavating and cleaning up two gods. Bacchus, this is the stone with carved on two sides, Bacchus on one side pouring a libation to his dog, and a female deity also pouring a libation. I don't know who she is, but absolutely memorable. And it's quite clear this is the corner of a major monument, a major Roman monument. Well, interestingly, in 1790, when the pump room was built, another corner was found. This one has got Jupiter, a clothed Jupiter, and a naked Hercules, the drinking Hercules, Bibax. And so two corners of a four-cornered monument. And Scarth have recorded another corner, which is identical, which was built into a buttress in the church of Compton Dando. And again, it's got a naked and clothed deity. So three corners of what undoubtedly was the main altar. Here is the, well, let's just take this one. We found later the base of the altar and the marks on it which showed where the structure was. So these corners were there, and there, and there's one still missing. So if anyone's seen one of these, and how did the one get to Compton Dando? I don't know, probably in the medieval period, someone was digging around here, found a useful bit of stone and carted it out to be built into the church. Amazing. I couldn't resist phoning a friend of mine on Sunday Times and telling him the story, and particularly he took to the idea of this Compton Dando. And I said, you know, it'd be very good if we could persuade them to let us have it back in Bath. And he wrote this lovely piece in the Sunday Times with the headline, "Hey Vicar, can we have our altar back?" Which didn't go down too well at the time, but we did in fact get that corner back, and it's now there. And the other thing, here, I'm jumping ahead a little bit. Here are the two of the corners standing on the platform there. This was after we did another piece of excavation. Now, also in the excavation, we found the dripping sewer pipe was up there. We found actually underneath the dripping sewer pipe this wonderful inscription, which says, "To the goddess Sulis, Lucius Marcius Memor, Haruspex," which is Augura, and then DD, Dona Dedit, gave this gift. And there is the inscription in place. There is the archaeology of the sewer pipe, now gone. And then behind the inscription is a stone slab cut out to take a statue. So here's the Haruspex, the man who opens up the animals and, on the altar and looks at their livers and foretells the future and so on, setting up a great statue of some sort here against the altar. So it was a profitable trench, that 1965 trench. It really gave us a lot to go on. And what we did was to try to get the city to allow us to follow it up. But as I say, Bath was in a bit of a doldrum at that stage. And I was slightly irritated, and I wrote a pop book on Roman Bath. And in that said, right at the end, you know, if there was ever anyone with forward-looking in Bath, they would see that the prospect of opening up underneath the pump room was, would be a wonderful thing for the city and so on. You know, sort of angry young man not getting his own way. And there it sort of stayed. And then I remember distinctly in 1974, when local government reorganisation took over, I got a letter from Ray Barrett, who was the director of leisure activity at the time, saying, "You don't know me, I've just read your book. I'd like you to know that there is someone with vision in Bath at last. Come and talk about it." And that's how, with Ray and David Beaton, and with some very forward-looking councillors, we managed to get the Bath, the pump room temple precinct scheme underway. And what we did, essentially, and I still have horrors about it, we didn't, mercifully, engineers did it, not archaeologists, but the cellars underneath the pump, that's the pump room floor, cellars underneath the pump room were simply smashed out, and steel girders were put in to keep up the pump room floor. So suddenly we had a big space underneath, and I remember David Beaton saying to me, "Now your job, when you do this excavation, is to make sure people come and see it the whole time. Visitors can come and see it. We'll build temporary walkways across it, and we must get the visitor numbers up to a million a year." And we did indeed do that. And what essentially we did, I can't go through the archaeology in a lot of detail, but take up the cellar floor, dig down through the mud, and then you come to this great mass of fallen masonry, Roman fallen masonry, tipped in from buildings all over the place, some of it carved and moulded and so on. And then moving the Roman masonry and recording it and storing it, then you come down to the foundations of the temple precinct and of the sort of colonnade that fronted the enclosure of the sacred spring, which is there. It was an amazing excavation. Here, for example, are two of the excavators actually excavating the temple steps. And the temple steps were people had hobnail boots, Romans had hobnail boots. And the hobnails wore away the stone, and the steps have been replaced 3 times, and we were able to, you can probably just see it here, the treads were replaced on 2 separate occasions. But finding these was absolutely remarkable. And then the temple itself, well, we knew about the temple from license reconstruction. You saw that before, but we actually found that block in the excavation, and that has now been replaced. It's part of the edge of the shield. Then during the excavation, it was discovered, when we just got started, it was discovered that the spring had an amoeba that caused meningitis. It was in the hot water. It's the ideal place for this amoeba to live. People were very worried about this. What the city did was to take off the floor, which Davis had laid in the sacred spring, right down, and you can see the Roman walls of the spring behind. So this is 1979, taking down all of Davis's work. And when that was done, no one quite knew what to do with it at that stage, but this had to be done first. What was discovered was that the floor wasn't properly supported, Davis's work wasn't good, and more to the point, the wall of the pump room hadn't been properly underpinned, and work needed to be done there. So clearly there was a major piece of excavation to be done, and that's what we are seen to be doing here. Right down in the sacred spring. Health and Safety at Work Act now a little bit better. Helmets and protective clothing. We had a lot of, because of the pollution of the spring and the possibility of amoebic meningitis, we did wear face masks and everything most of the time. And what we discovered was, there is the wall of the reservoir. We found these wooden piles, Roman wooden piles, sort of consolidating the ground, the soggy ground, and we found quite a lot of the sediment which had accumulated in the Roman period in the sacred spring. And we were able then to put it all together quite nicely, to show, for example, how they built it. They built a ring beam, first of all, of those piles, beaten it down into the ground, and dug a channel to get all the hot water away, and then they could dig down into the spring, lower the water table enough to be able to build and dig the foundation trench for the reservoir wall. And here in the section you can see the ring beam of piles and the reservoir wall, and the sheets of lead which Davis had found. We've put back in the reconstruction drawing. There was a little bit of the lead left. And then, as it was an artist's reconstruction, at a later stage it was enclosed in this great chamber, and it must have been very much like this. Ferns and things growing, mists and fog and all the rest of it. I think deliberately making it special and sacred and difficult to see. The priest could come in through one door, and visitors in the bath could look at it through 3 openings, which you can now still look at. You can now still look through those openings into the spring, just as the Romans did. And of course, in the spring, we found large quantities of votive offerings. I've no time to go through them now, but coins, 11,000 coins, some of them gold, pewter curses inscribed with messages to the deity, this lovely brooch, these pattery, one of silver, the other two of pewter, for pouring libations, and then various bits of decoration, possibly for regalia and so on. A huge amount of wonderful material, reflecting on the beliefs and the religious life of Roman Bath. And we were also able to reconstruct the sequence of things going on. So first of all, there was the simple temple with the altar in front of it, and then the temple was enlarged with these little pavilions, and the spring was enclosed in this great chamber. And then the chamber wall itself was a bit dodgy. The foundations were not good, so they had to put buttresses in to buttress it up. And in front of the main door from the altar into the sacred spring, there was a monument, a quadrifrons, a four-footed monument. And there were enough bits found for us to be able to reconstruct it. It's a rather unusual thing called a Syrian arch. And what there is there are two cupids here holding up a roundel with a head in it, and all we can see is a spiky crown from that head. And that must be the god Sol, the sun god. So here, over the altar is behind you here, and the door into the sacred spring is there. And here is this great monument with the cupids holding up Sol's head there. This is the sun, this is the south, and you're now going in to see the sacred spring. Now, when the original excavations were carried out, they also found large quantities of stone that didn't belong to the main pediment. Here are some of the pieces. This is Lyson's illustration. And then 1813. And then Lysons tries to put them together and comes up with this sort of little cupids in the upper register, seated deities in the lower register, and the goddess Luna presiding over them. When we got to work, we found that, in fact, it was a bit more, he got it more or less right, but it was a bit more complicated. There were more bits, and we had to extend the monument, as it were, to take in all the bits that were found. But essentially, Lyson's original reconstruction is pretty well it. And here is Luna, the goddess Luna. After we'd drawn this reconstruction, we did our excavation in the precinct and found that wonderful piece of sculpture, which is a dog looking up at his master or mistress in this case, because it's probably the goddess Diana, and here is her hunting bow. And that piece is almost certainly in there. One day, more pieces will be found, I expect, if more excavation is done. So we then have the main temple with its pavilions, the altar, here this great quadrifrons with the head of Sol, the sun god, and then the other monument we've just looked at is almost certainly here, opposite this one, and what more appropriate in its pediment than the head of the goddess Luna, the night sky. So you've got the sun looking across the altar to the moon. There's wonderful sort of structuralism in the arrangement of things in this precinct. Well, finally, that's more or less where we are at the moment. So we've got the Roman baths here and the Roman temple here. We've got bits of other buildings dotted around. But there are other questions, for example. There are bits of a monument, which I think is probably a circular tholos monument. They've got to go somewhere. They're very fine. After thinking this through, I thought they were probably here somewhere underneath the abbey, so we've put the Tholos monument there. We did originally put a theatre there in the first reconstruction, but thinking it through and finding somewhere to put the Tholos was there. There must be a theatre. In some of the Gaulish towns, the theatre would be on the axis of the temple. I wonder whether, in fact, the theatre, if there is one, is under Union Street now, because that's where the land rises up, and that would be a good place to put a theatre. But these are the sorts of unanswered questions. If someone would give us a few £1 million and knock down the abbey, we'd be able to sort this problem out without any problems at all. But I don't think it'll happen in my lifetime anyway. It makes the point, I think, that I've been trying to make all the way through, that each generation builds upon the work of a previous generation, and slowly and slowly and slowly the picture emerges. It's never complete, and there's always more to add to it. There are always modifications to be made, and that's one of the great excitements of archaeology. Now, I just want to end with a quotation, because I'm talking about coming out of the mud. The drain blocked up, the whole of the centre of Bath was flooded, a big thick layer of almost 2 meters of black mud accumulated over quite a lot of this centre. But the bits of walls were still standing, and there is a very remarkable poem, a Saxon poem called The Ruin. So it was written in probably the 6th, 7th century. And I just want to read a bit of it, because this is how a person in the Saxon period, after Bath had crumbled and the marsh had begun to sort of eat into the city, this is how they saw it. This is the words. "Splendid is this masonry, the fates destroyed it. The strong building crashed, the work of the giants moulders away. The roofs have fallen, the towers are in ruins, and the barred gate is broken. There is frost on the lime. The gaping roofs are shattered and decayed and sapped by old age. Earth's grip holds them." And that's what archaeology is about. The mud preserves all the evidence that we need to be able to build pictures of what it may have looked like at the time. Thank you.
Barry, thank you on behalf of everybody for an absolutely splendid unravelling of the story. I use the word unravelling in the right sense, as how Roman Bath in particular, has appeared from the mud. You never fail to engage and entertain and fascinate us. We have a few minutes for questions. If anyone would like to ask questions, if Barry's kindly agreed to take them. Gordon.
Do you have, can you tell us when it was started to be built, the Romans started to build, and how long it roughly took to build the baths? Do you have any estimates?
Yes. I think what we discovered was that in the pre-Roman period, there had been some building work. In excavating in the spring, we found, before the Roman reservoir was built, someone in the Iron Age had built a sort of ramp of gravel down to where the head of the water was bursting out of the ground. And they had fronted it with a sort of wattle fence and so on. And that was presumably the place where they went down and stood and threw offerings into the water. And that, at a guess, is certainly pre-Roman, and it could even go back to the 1st century BC. When the Romans came, I think there would be no way that they couldn't have done something straight away. You know, it would have been such an amazing phenomenon. But there was probably, right at the beginning of the Roman period, there would have been a fort somewhere it might be across the river, not on the main site itself, across the river, and then the roads would have been laid out the Fosse Way and so on. And Irvine did find some early streets which predated the precinct of the temple. So we're talking perhaps then of Roman invasion in 43 AD, so we're talking about some building work going on between 43 and say the 70s. And then the main baths and the temple really look on art historical and architectural grounds as though they are Flavian. They belong to the period of the Flavian emperors in the 70s and 80s of the first century AD. So, and then from then on, of course, they were added to and added to and added to. But we still need to know more about the very early phases of Bath. And it's all there, you know, it's all underground. It'll be found eventually.
Thank you. Another question?
Just ask the challenges now economically, for example, how difficult it would be to get finance to get someone inspired enough by a call to continue this, considering the environment we're in.
Yes, absolutely. And the point actually was made to me when we were putting up the temple precinct scheme in 1974. There was one local councillor who was quite vocal and said this is a waste of money. And I had a fair amount of sympathy. What she said was that our fire service needs re-equipping, you know, and that's a very difficult thing to argue. It's a sort of sense of balance. I think my answer to that one was that when we found those temple steps, we were unsure that there was not enough money to actually expose them. And we did a little piece in the local newspaper about it and said, you know, we weren't expecting to find the steps, and we found them and said, you know, it'd be nice to be able to make them part of the display and everything. And then I got a letter from some kids in one of the local schools saying, you know, dear Mr. Cunliffe, we've read about this and we want to help you preserve our temple steps. And we've started saving money, and we've got £3.20. You know, it was an absolutely wonderful letter. And needless to say, those children were given, that class was given a view of the temple steps and so on. But you know, it's the balanced values. One of the things I will say is that research excavations and the infrastructure which would have to be put in are very, very expensive. But there are major grant-giving bodies, European grant-giving bodies, that dole out. There's one project I'm involved with, a Swedish project, which has got a sort of €6 million budget. You know, there is quite a lot of money around for really good research programs. Then we get to the rescue work, which is rather better, because the governments of the past have passed increasingly stern laws on the basis of polluter must pay. So if you're doing building work in the centre of a city like Bath, and that building work is likely to touch archaeological remains, then the developer has to pay for that work to be done. So there will be a constant flow of money coming in for the urgent work. And then special projects, as I say, knocking down the Abbey, special projects like that, one could get grants for.
Perhaps we should have an HS3 going through the middle of Bath.
I'm sorry?
Perhaps we should have HS3 going through
what
the
a
middle
good
of
idea.
Bath.
Yeah.
Hello, I was wondering if you could complete the history by telling us what happened in medieval times between...
Wow.
Was it forgotten?
Yes, okay, well, let's use that illustration. What happened, don't forget, you've got these great... What you've got at the end of the Roman period is the wall standing. You've got the great buildings with their roofs off and collapsing and so on, and then lesser buildings around. And then this marsh forming in the centre here. Then the Anglo-Saxon poet comes and sees all this and writes this wonderful poem about it. Go on into the late Saxon period, where you still have the wall, and this is taken over as one of the Alfredian burhs. Alfred built fortified towns against attack and sort of Viking attack. He chose Bath as one of many fortified towns because it had a jolly good wall to it as well. And I think the street grid, the modern street grid of Bath, is mostly based on the street grid of the Alfredian burh. And then nothing much happens except it becomes medievalized. The wall is slightly rebuilt. The religious function of the centre is carried on by Christians who build the precursor of the abbey. So you get the town accreting and accreting until the image that I started with which was Speed's image, doesn't look very different to that. And this would be 400 AD, and Speed is, 1611. So Bath hasn't changed much in that period. It had become less grand, but it hadn't changed very much.
But they did lose track of the Great Bath.
Yes, they'd lost track of the Great Bath. They'd lost track of the temple itself. The only thing that really made itself dominant were the springs. You know, you can't do anything with a million litres of water a day, and it's a presence. So, and there's always this consciousness of of Solinus writing about the Roman baths and the Temple of Minerva, and this consciousness of the Saxon poem. So people will have known that there were remains here.
This question's not about the baths, actually. I noticed on that particular drawing there is a bridge. Is that where you think the bridge was, or is that just to say there was a bridge somewhere and we haven't a clue where?
No, it's just most of that is artist's imagination based on talking to archaeologists. So there must be, there were probably 2 or 3 crossings. There must be a crossing in that area, judging by the amount of building on both sides. My own view is that, there's no hard evidence for it, but that the fort of the invasion period, Roman invasion period, was over on this side, and that the Fosse Way probably came up to the fort and crossed the river somewhere there. But there's no archaeological evidence for that.
How would you characterise its importance in all the spas of Europe? I mean, there are obviously hot springs throughout Europe.
Yeah.
How would it compare in importance?
If we're talking about hot springs in the Roman period,
yes.
Yeah. I think it probably is in the top 2 or 3. I personally would put it right at the top because of how much we know about it, you know, how much we know about the arrangement of that temple precinct. It's easy enough to look at the plans and say, there's the temple, there's the altar, and so on. But to think of it in 3 dimensions, to think of that quadrifrons with Sol, the god Sol, to think of the lunar pediment and so on, you're into a different dimension of understanding there. You're into the idea of how the Romans sort of structured their world. That altar was at the crossing point of all these power lines, as it were, between one goddess and the god and the temple and so on. So we've got all that detail, which many of these other sites don't have. We also do have, the sculpture is wonderful. And the sculpture refers back to the river god, for example. That's almost certainly a sort of Celtic god idea. The god with snakes and things. He's a male god. So that gets us into discussions about how the Romans integrated the belief systems of the people that they conquered. And the name itself, I should have said, Sulis Minerva. Sulis is the Celtic name of the deity. And I can just imagine that the first couple of Romans who came here and found some scruffy old Iron Age Briton chucking offerings into the spring, and saying, well, okay, what's going on here? And saying, well, this is our god Sulis, and we're making offerings. And the Romans saying, well, okay, what does your god Sulis? We don't have a god Sulis. What does your goddess Sulis do? What's she good at? And then he would list all the things that she was good at, cure, and she's valiant, and she's very wise, and all these things. And then the Romans say, oh, yeah, we've got one of those called Minerva. So from then on, it's Sulis Minerva. So it's all this, it's more than just the building. It's the infrastructure of our understanding.
We have time for one more question.
Did the swamping of the area and the moistness of the soil contribute to the preserving of all the remains? And if so, is that going to create a challenge with the exposure of them to a completely different, to the atmosphere, as well as obviously to millions of feet every year? A challenge that's going to be difficult to overcome in terms of keeping it open for a long-term future?
Yes. It's a very fair question. I think we'll start off with the idea that those structures which we've exposed were built to be exposed. So they're meant to be there to be weathered and so on. They are above-ground structures. The marsh that formed around them did a lot to stop them being robbed away. People couldn't get at the stone. It was very valuable as building stone, but because the marsh formed over that central area, they couldn't actually get to those stones except the vicar of Compton Dando. So the marsh preserved to that extent. Taking it away, I think, has caused no great problem. The only real problem is rising water and things like that, which is a basic problem anyway. There's always that to be contended with in making sure that the growth of algae and so on is controlled. The marsh itself, of course, is immensely valuable because the conditions are anaerobic in that marsh, so things would be preserved. And we did get quite a lot of seeds and bits of wood and so on, so we were able to build up an understanding of the environment as it developed. So, but I think the answer to your basic question is the buildings, the structures are fine so long as we keep a close eye on them.
Thank you. Just a codicil on the cornerstones of the altar. We did, as Barry said, get the cornerstone back from Compton Dando because it was getting weathered badly. You can now see it at the temple precinct, more or less where it would have stood. And we paid for the buttress to be made good at Compton Dando Church. We then invited the entire village to a special visit to see it in situ. We gave them a glass of wine and a peanut, and when they saw it in situ, they absolutely got it and realised that there had been a sort of cycle here that had come full circle. But interestingly, over the porch, when at Compton Dando Church, when there had been a number of renovations, there is the date 1790. I just wonder if that is when the stone was found. Taken to Compton Dando, which was originally on Abbey lands, and then came back to us in the 1990s. So that's just a possibility there. And of course, the fourth one is still missing. And if we find a fifth one, we'll know there weren't cornerstones.
There's a real problem. Well, I love that. I didn't know that, Stephen. That's really interesting. You can just imagine some hack architect for Compton Dando seeing this excavation going on and slipping a few quid to the navvies to put a load of stone on his cart for the church. Yeah.
Okay, we should break now. We have a half-hour's break, after which we'll reconvene in here to learn more about the research opportunities at Bath Record Office. So please feel free to mingle, talk to each other. And just finally, Join me again in a round of applause to thank Barry for a brilliant talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen.